Good morning. Please be seated. Please mute your phones. Welcome to the Sunday program of the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago. My name is Svetlana Beckman. I'm a member of the society, and I will be your moderator today. Actually, I'll be your interviewer today. I'll tell you more in a second. I will start by saying a few words about humanism. Guided by reason, inspired by compassion, and informed by experience, the humanistic life stance encourages us to live life well and fully. It evolved through the ages and continues to develop through the efforts of thoughtful people who recognize that values and ideals, however carefully wrought, are subject to change as our knowledge and understanding advance. I'm not sure where that quote comes from, but to me that really encapsulates humanism very well. Our programs on Sunday mornings address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts, and sciences, to name just a few. And today's program is part of our ongoing series, if you will, on the humanities. And it's my pleasure as part of today's program to interview a longtime society member and history buff, John Ungashick, on the topic of Harry S. Truman and the election of 1948. And before we start, I want to mention that we have folks in the audience. Thank you for being here. In the physical audience, we also have people in the virtual audience on YouTube. Thank you for joining. I welcome you all, and after we conclude the interview, there will be opportunities to ask questions. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
So to start, maybe you could introduce us to Harry Truman and tell us a few things about his biography.
Okay, before I start, I'd just like to recognize my wife, Judy, my daughter, Stephanie, and Stephanie's new husband, Eric Pipenhagen. Eric and Stephanie were married in February, and we're so happy to welcome Eric into our family. It's really great. Okay. Harry Truman, and actually he was named Harry S. Truman, but the S does not stand for Samuel or anything else. It was his two grandfathers both had S as their first name, and they just used S. So everybody, what was Harry Truman's middle name? It was just S, that's it. He was born on May 8th, 1884. He grew up in Independence, Missouri. During his early life, Matt would probably appreciate this, he served what was called as a, if I'm saying this properly, a Shabbos goy for his Jewish neighbors. This meant that he carried out tasks meant for them that they were unable to do on their own on the Sabbath. He briefly attended community college but did not graduate, although he was a voracious reader all throughout his life. He held several odd jobs before returning to work on the family farm in 1906, where he stayed until he enlisted in the Army in 1917 as the U.S. entered World War I. He was only able to pass the physical by memorizing the eye chart, as he was close to being legally blind without his glasses. It is generally conceded that World War I made Harry Truman, as he served as an artillery captain, was highly praised for his service. He had been courting Bess Wallace since 1911, but she turned down his repeated proposals as her mother thought him unworthy. In fact, I've heard stories that even at the time Truman became president, Bess Truman's mother still thought he was unworthy. He was only able to, however, he persisted, and they were married in 1919 and eventually had one child, a daughter, Margaret. His efforts as a businessman were unsuccessful as his haberdashery went bankrupt in the recession of 1921. Due to his loyalty to the local Pendergast Democratic political machine, he was elected Jackson County Judge in 1922. He was then elected as presiding judge in 1926 and served in that capacity until 1934, when he was a surprise choice as a Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate, and with Pendergast's support, along with his developing friendship with FDR aide Harry Hopkins, secured his election. Up to that point and all the way until 1940, Truman was a relatively unknown senator, was chiefly known as a Pendergast loyalist, a firm supporter of the New Deal, and a well-liked card-playing member of the Senate insiders. He overcame the Pendergast stigma and earned a modest national reputation as a leader of a subcommittee investigating fraud in the awarding of defense contracts. And that brings us right up to 1944.
So tell us then how Harry S. found himself sort of one heartbeat away from the presidency. How did that come about?
Okay, this is pretty unusual when you figure in the context of the way things are today, but the insiders in the Roosevelt administration knew that FDR's health in 1944 was precarious. His blood pressure was very high and he had serious heart problems, but this information was not shared with the public. FDR was intent on wrapping up World War II and working on a lasting peace, post-war arrangement, and refused to recognize his health issues. Therefore, the powers that be knew that the man picked as VP in 1944 might very well succeed to the presidency before the end of FDR's term. The current Vice President, Henry Wallace, was the darling of the left wing of the party, but he was unacceptable to the more conservative elements, especially the South. In effect, Wallace was an early version of Bernie Sanders. He did achieve some success in chairing the Board of Economic Warfare before and during World War II, and acted as an unofficial ambassador at large to Latin America, where he was well received, but he was just too cozy with the Soviet Union and totally unacceptable to the mainstream moderates in the party. Other VP candidates included James Burns and William O. Douglas. Burns had previously served as governor and U.S. Senator from South Carolina, and also had a short stint on the U.S. Supreme Court, but he was an ardent segregationist and therefore unacceptable to Northern liberals. Douglas was a sitting member of the Supreme Court, but had no prior experience in electoral politics. Harry Truman, on the other hand, was a sitting U.S. Senator from Missouri who had a name for himself investigating corruption in government armaments contracts. Since Missouri was technically a southern state, he was acceptable to the South, but he was not a member of the Southern Bloc, which opposed racial equality, and was reluctantly acceptable to Northern liberals. FDR stayed out of the VP race, and Truman was eventually nominated, although Wallace supporters put up a last-ditch effort for their man.
And who was on the other side? Against whom was FDR running in that election?
Well, I'll get to that in a second. Thomas E. Dewey, the governor of New York, was nominated by the Republicans, and even though he conducted a strong race, the electorate, unaware of FDR's health problems, were loath to change horses in midstream. The Democrats carried 16 states and won the electoral vote 432 to 99. Shortly after the election, FDR undertook a hazardous journey, especially given his health issues, to Cairo, Egypt, and then Yalta in the Crimea for a summit conference with world leaders Chiang Kai-shek, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. If you want to show the Yalta conference picture up there. Okay, you can see here, I don't know how well you can make it out, but even though FDR was only 62 years old at this time, he's very, very haggard. You can, by looking at the picture, if you can see it up close, you can see how terrible he looks. Much was written later, especially during the McCarthy era in the early 1950s, about how FDR and his communist influence advisors, so-called, sold out Eastern Europe at Yalta. But in reality, the Western leaders got the best deal available, given that the Red Army was already in control of the area. Roosevelt came back and addressed the Congress, detailing the results of his visit, but kept Vice President Truman completely in the dark. Then on April 12, 1945, FDR died at Warm Springs, Georgia, and Truman was suddenly elevated to the presidency. He had no knowledge of the research on the atom bomb or many other aspects of the war.
Did he, before we talk about his first year in office, how much did Truman know about the dire state of FDR's health? Do we know?
He was not an insider, so he may have. There was a rumor that an anecdote that he had one time, one of the few meetings he had with FDR before FDR died. They had breakfast together, and he said later that he couldn't believe how bad a shape he was in. He was shaking and whatever, but that was just an anecdotal observation. It wasn't where somebody told me, hey, FDR's really in bad shape.
Right.
So they kept him in the dark. Very, very unfortunate.
So here he is, thrust into presidency. Tell us about what the first year in office was like.
Okay. FDR had been looking forward to attending the founding session of the new United Nations organization, which was to be held on April 25th in San Francisco. 46 nations were to attend, and it was debated as to whether or not FDR's death was a reason to cancel the conference. But Truman was adamant that it was too important for both the world and FDR's legacy, and the conference took place. The charter of the new organization was agreed upon, and with the horrors of the war still part of recent memory, this was a very hopeful time in world history. The UN has been praised and demonized by many people since that day, but in the main, I feel it's been a net plus in world history, especially in the area of peacekeeping and relief, disaster relief. No great power war has occurred since 1945, and the UN has certainly been part of that dynamic. It became part of the hysteria surrounding the McCarthy era that plots were allegedly hatched and agreed upon at the conference, which led to the communist takeover of large parts of the globe in the decade following the communist, led by communist sympathizers such as Alger Hiss. On May 8, 1945, the Germans finally surrendered and the war in Europe was over. On May 17th, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, later replaced by Clement Attlee after a UK election in which Attlee's Labour Party came out ahead, met for another summit conference at Potsdam outside Berlin. It was already becoming apparent that Stalin was not living up to his promises at Yalta for free elections in Eastern Europe, but this would become much more obvious later. FDR had always relied on the belief in his personal magnetism to influence Stalin, but it did not work. And Truman quickly saw through Stalin as the ruthless dictator he was in reality. During the conference, the atom bomb was successfully tested, and Truman disclosed the information to Stalin. At the close of the conference, the Potsdam Declaration was issued, which demanded that Japan surrender unconditionally or suffer, quote, prompt and utter destruction, unquote, but did not directly mention the atomic bomb. There exists much controversy about Truman's decision to drop the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early 1945. In fact, we even had a program here at the Society about it a few years ago. I understand and sympathize with those who oppose the decision, but personally I think it was correct, as it prevented a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands, which would have caused untold casualties, both Japanese and American and Allied. It must also be noted that the Japanese militarists who were in charge had vowed to fight to the last man, and this was demonstrated in the fanatical resistance on Okinawa. In any event, Emperor Hirohito, for the first time in his life, made a radio address and asked his people to, quote, endure the unendurable, unquote. As an example of how far the Japanese were removed from reality, the emperor did not use the word surrender, but said that the war situation has developed not necessarily to our advantage, a rather extreme understatement. On the American home front, it was an uneasy transition from war to peace, and Truman was blamed for the problems which ensued.
I'm wondering, do we know what the public opinion in the U.S. was about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
I think because of the extreme feelings about the betrayal at Pearl Harbor, you know, that we had been attacked without warning. I think probably, when I don't have a poll to support this, that there was overwhelming support for the atom bomb, just to get the war over, and that it was felt that if we did, like I said, at Okinawa they fought to the last man, and it caused thousands of American casualties, and so I think the Americans probably very much supported it. Now, clearly there were some people that did not. A lot of the scientists that worked on the atomic bomb project thought that it was there should have been something else, maybe a demonstration explosion or some such thing. But I think the overwhelming majority of American people, in my opinion, supported it at the time.
Okay, so now we are after the war in the U.S. His first term, 46 to 48. What happens?
The Republicans capitalized on the unease in the country and lingering negative feelings about the New Deal, and swept the off-year elections in 1946, picking up 12 Senate seats and 55 House seats. It was the first time they had controlled Congress since 1932. they vowed to roll back the New Deal, but many of the New Deal policies were so popular that they could not be reversed. However, they did pass some bills, such as the Taft-Hartley Act, which had a seriously negative impact on the labor movement, which had achieved great strides since FDR's first inauguration. Truman vetoed the bill, but his veto was overridden. Meanwhile, on the foreign policy front, Stalin continued to ignore his promises made at the Yalta Conference and deepened his control of Eastern Europe. Despite the fact that the U.S. and its Western allies could do little to stop him, Truman was blamed. He countered with the so-called Truman Doctrine, which he announced in a speech to Congress on March 12, 1947. The doctrine was based on what became known as the containment theory. In other words, even though it was realistically not possible to roll back Soviet influence in areas already under their control, the U.S. and its allies would contain the Soviets and all other communist-inspired groups from gaining control of any new area. The initial focus was on Greece and Turkey, which were then experiencing communist-inspired insurgencies. The U.S. assisted them with military and financial aid. As well-meaning as this doctrine seemed at the time, it eventually morphed into inflexible opposition to any insurgency which had even minor communist support or was thought to have communist support, and led directly to the U.S. fiasco in Vietnam decades later. On a more positive note, what became known as the Marshall Plan was proposed by General George Marshall, then the U.S. Secretary of State, in a March 5, 1947 speech at Harvard University. The plan had been discussed within the Truman administration, and it was determined that Secretary Marshall, given his stellar reputation, should be the one to introduce the plan and serve as its spokesperson. The plan involved financial aid to the countries of Europe which were still suffering the effects of World War II. The plan was not intended to single-handedly rebuild the shattered European economies, but to provide seed money for the countries involved to rebuild themselves. A key element completely ignored in the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, and many feel contributed to another war a generation later, was to recognize that a healthy Germany was essential to European-wide prosperity. A key element was that the U.S. demanded the countries involved come up with a detailed plan on their own before receiving any funds. Many people feel that this forced cooperation sowed the seeds for the later common market, which morphed into the current-day European Union. By uniting the former enemies, especially France, Germany, and the UK, the system not only fostered prosperity, but also eliminated the scourge of war from Europe, at least until the current events in Ukraine.
Before you go on, I'm curious, like in approximate dollars, like how much did the U.S. spend on the Marshall Plan?
I'm not sure, but I don't think it was a whole lot more than maybe $12 or $15 billion, which in today's money is a lot more, but this wasn't an enormous amount.
Was an enormous amount relative to like the budget, the overall budget of the U.S.
It was a substantial contribution from the U.S., but it wasn't, it was something that we could certainly easily afford. We were the only country that had not suffered terrible devastation in World War II, so there's no other country that was in a position to do it anyway. And like I said, it wasn't, we basically gave them the money and everything, we just provided seed money, and they had to cooperate among themselves. And I think this cooperation was extremely critical. And as I said, I think that helped a lot into the unity that eventually became the European Union of today.
And was it the State Department who reviewed these plans that the countries, I'm just curious, yeah?
Marshall and the State Department,
Yeah.
along with some other people, and I believe they had a subcommittee of strictly the Marshall Plan.
Right, cool. Okay, yes, please, go on.
The Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, were invited to join, but they refused, which widened the gap between East and West. The plan also incurred opposition in the U.S., where Republican Senator Robert Taft denounced it as a Marshall Plan, M-A-R-T-I-A-L. However, in retrospect, the plan was a rousing success and earned Marshall the Nobel Peace Prize several years later. The period in question also saw the beginning of decolonialization, as India and Pakistan achieved independence from the British Empire on August 15, 1947. But this led to chaos, with millions of deaths as Muslims and Hindus fought over the boundaries of their respective countries, and a massive refugee crisis ensued. The U.S. was not involved in this situation, but it was deeply embarrassing to the existing UK government, and given their strong ties to the U.S., Truman's political ranking took a hit. On May 15, 1948, the British mandate for Palestine ended, and the Jewish authorities declared independence, which the U.S. government quickly recognized. What this mandate, what the UN passed, was a policy where there would be the occupied territory would be split up into a Jewish state and a Arab state. It was rumored, the U.S. quickly recognized the Jewish state. It was rumored that this was a cheap trick by Truman to ensure Jewish votes in the November election. But Truman was a faithful Christian who believed that the reconstitution of the Jewish state was a precondition for the return of Jesus. And he was also influenced by his old business partner Eddie Jacobson, who was sympathetic to Zionism. Secretary Marshall, for geopolitical reasons, was adamantly opposed to recognizing the new state. In fact, he even threatened to resign, but he talked him out of it. But he was overridden by Truman with support from foreign policy advisor Clark Clifford. All the surrounding Arab countries immediately declared war on the new Jewish state, but they miraculously emerged victorious, and in the subsequent ceasefire negotiations ended up with a far larger state than they were awarded to them by the United Nations.
A couple of questions. Do we know what the public opinion in the U.S. was about the formation, creation of the State of Israel? Do we know any?
I think, given that the fact that the horrors of the Holocaust were becoming known at the time, I think there was a significant amount of support. There were a lot of people who did not support it. Marshall, I think, felt, because he was a completely non-political person, he felt that this would disrupt oil supplies, we would disrupt our relationship with the Arab countries. Geopolitically, it wasn't really important, and a lot of people felt that, this was just the Zionist dream was really not realistic, and there were a lot of things. But I think overall, people were fairly sympathetic. Quite obviously, the Jewish community was completely supportive. It's not 100%, but the vast majority were.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think it went over well, and a lot of people felt, this was just going to be something that was going to fade away real quickly because the Arabs outnumbered the Jews, 10 to 1, 8 to 1, whatever, and that there'd be a walkover, that would be the end of it, but it didn't happen that way, for lots of reasons.
Yeah, and I'm curious when, obviously, this initial war, the U.S. presumably didn't support financially or militarily, but at what point, if you know, did the U.S. begin to render actual financial and military
I think
assistance?
this was a little bit later. It certainly wasn't right away. Once the state was established, there was a 20-year period from 1947 to 1967 where it was relative peace. And I think during that time, the so-called Jewish lobby became a little bit more of a factor, and there was a certain amount of aid, but there was certainly no aid initially. The U.S. did not provide any financial aid or anything. The U.S. Jews certainly supported it in both directly and indirect ways, but the U.S. government did not.
Okay. And that brings us to the election of 1948.
Okay. FDR had nominated Henry Wallace to be Secretary of Commerce as a kind of consolation prize after the 1944 election, and he was confirmed before Roosevelt died in April 1945. However, Wallace, who was still upset about not being named vice president, publicly criticized Truman for his handling of the situation with the Soviet Union, and Truman forced him to resign in September 1946. Wallace became editor of the New Republic, a respected leftist publication, and continued to oppose U.S. foreign policy toward the Soviet Union. He was also critical of the tame civil rights agenda of the Democrats. He finally broke with the party in September 1947 and formed a new progressive party, which was supported by such luminaries as Rexford Tugwell, a prominent New Dealer, musicians Paul Robeson and Pete Seeger, plus future presidential nominee George McGovern. McGovern, of course, was a much younger man at the time. Wallace began campaigning around the country, but was tainted by rumors that pro-communist or active communist advisors had too much influence upon him. It was felt by many that this defection of left-wing supporters would be extremely harmful to Truman's chances in the 1948 election. The seeds of the subsequent McCarthy anti-communist era were sown at this time. Republicans held their convention in late 1940 and nominated Tom Dewey, the 1944 standard bearer, on the third ballot. He faced stiff opposition from Robert Taft and Harold Stassen, the former governor of Minnesota. Symbolic of the campaign he later waged against Truman was Dewey's acceptance speech at the convention, where he used the word unity or united 9 times, although it was difficult to determine what he might have sought unity for or against. He referenced nothing specific save that he favored the unimaginable possibilities of atomic energy to bring men and women a larger and fuller life. Dewey represented the Eastern Establishment internationalist wing of the party, while Taft was the personification of the Midwest isolationist wing. Dewey's role was later taken up a generation later by another New York governor, Nelson Rockefeller. As strange as it sounds today, in 1948, the Republicans were strong in New York and New England, while the Democrats were supreme in the South, the exact opposite of the present situation. In reality, Dewey and his crowd were comfortable with many of the New Deal reforms, but felt they could carry them out more efficiently. Unlike 1944, when Dewey picked arch-conservative Ohio Senator John Bricker as his running mate, he chose California Governor Earl Warren, a fellow moderate, as his 1948 VP. The Republican platform included many so-called progressive items which were later opposed or rejected, which were bitterly opposed or rejected by the Taft wing of the party. This would come back to haunt them later. On June 24, 1948, as the Republican convention was wrapping up, the Soviets announced that they were stopping all traffic to Berlin. The city was located within the Soviet occupation zone, but the city of Berlin itself was split into 4 sections, one assigned to each of the World War II allies, the Soviets, the US, the UK, and France. In effect, Stalin wanted to starve out the western sectors and force them to be reabsorbed into the Soviet zone. All land links were cut off, but the Allies responded with an airlift of supplies, which continued until Stalin called off the blockade in May 1949. At first, it was thought an airlift was impossible given the amount of the supplies of food, fuel, and other incidentals which were required, but General Lucius Clay, the Allied commander, assured President Truman that he was up to the task, and surprisingly, he was proven correct. A few isolationists and the hardcore of the Wallace movement, which had never fully shed their Depression-era romance with communism, criticized the operation, but overall it had wide support and helped to modestly boost Truman's approval ratings. The Democrats met in Philadelphia from July 12th to the 14th. The party was very demoralized but had no real option but to renominate Truman. Overtures were made to World War II hero Dwight Eisenhower to run as a National Unity Democratic candidate, but he declined. However, dissatisfaction with Truman ran deep in the party, and after a move to draft William O. Douglas bore no fruit, along with a short-lived interest in Florida Senator Claude Pepper, interest turned to Kentucky Senator Alben Barkley. He was the keynote speaker and gave a rousing speech which some compared to William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech in 1896. It was felt that if at that moment Barkley had given his assent, the convention might have been stampeded in his favor, but he declined and the moment passed. Partly as a consolation, Truman picked the 71-year-old Barkley as his vice presidential running mate. In order to keep the South in line, a very tepid civil rights plank was adopted by the platform committee, and they came up for a vote by the whole convention. Northern liberals were intent upon a more vigorous civil rights plank because they believed it was needed to blunt the impact of the Wallace defection. Hubert Humphrey, then the mayor of Minneapolis, but a candidate for the U.S. Senate, was discouraged by almost everyone for his plan to contest the plank. After talking to his father, who said to him, "This may tear the party apart, but if you feel strongly, then you have to go with it. You can't run away from your conscience." Humphrey gave a rousing speech and galvanized the convention to adopt the minority plank, which was far more aggressive than the initial language. The key portion of Humphrey's speech was the phrase, "Get out of the shadow of states' rights and into the bright sunshine of human rights." The plank carried by the narrow vote of 651 to 582 and made a national figure of Humphrey in the process. In response, several Southern delegations walked out and later formed the States' Rights or Dixiecrat Party, which nominated South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond for president. On the surface, this looked to be a disaster for the party, as that now they had lost both the Wallace liberals and Southern segregationists.
Before you continue, could you elaborate a little bit on what was actually contained in the in the minority plank that actually got adopted by the convention? Like, what were some of the concrete aspects?
Well, they wanted to basically eliminate segregation, which was then endemic in the South. They wanted to
With like a federal law?
federal, which didn't really pass until the 1960s, right? A federal civil rights law which outlawed segregation, that kind of prefigured the Brown versus Board of Education, which legally set the precedent for ending segregation. And they just felt that there should be, a more vigorous, federal support for, the whole idea of, the civil rights movement, which up to that time had strictly been left to the states.
Thank you.
On August 11th, the Dixiecrats met in Houston, Texas, and formally nominated Thurmond for president and Mississippi Governor Fielding Wright as vice president. Delegates attended from 13 states, 11 from the old Confederacy, plus Kentucky and Oklahoma. Speeches were given extolling the glories of states' rights, almost as if the Civil War had never taken place. At that time, strict segregation was part and parcel of Southern life, but cracks were beginning to show in the facade. In his acceptance speech, Truman claimed that the Democrats' civil rights platform had been patterned after a Russian law written by Stalin in 1920 and was made to order for communist use in their designs upon national security. He also claimed that most black people accepted and welcomed segregation, as it afforded them the right to form their own communities where they were far more comfortable. Of course, the fact that the segregation regime was wholly run by and enforced by the white establishment was of no consequence. In 2004, it was definitively established that Thurmond, who died in 2003, had fathered a child in 1926 by his black maid. He did support her indirectly, but had little contact with her or her mother throughout his life. Of course, had this become known in 1948, Truman's political career would have been over. On July 26th,
Could I just interrupt for a second? You make an interesting comment. You say that cracks were beginning to show in the facade
Well,
of
I
segregation
think just in general,
the South.
there were certain people like, Missouri wasn't a Confederate state, but certainly Truman was a supporter of civil rights. Alvin Barkley was certainly a supporter of civil rights. And there were certain other people here and there that felt that, the whole civil rights movement, Martin Luther King certainly wasn't on the scene yet, but there were certain people that felt that, the time had come, enough time had gone by since the Civil War that something had to happen. It wasn't until 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education that it really became a little bit more. And plus, I feel that, Humphrey's speech in 1948, kind of was a significant element in the whole equation too. On July 26, Truman made a masterful political move by calling a Republican-led Congress for a special session. It was popularly known as the Turnip Congress, and July 26 was a traditional day for planting turnips in Missouri. Truman demanded that the Congress enact some items which were contained in the Republican platform, such as civil rights legislation, an anti-lynching law, and an expansion of Social Security. In reality, these items had been placed in the platform over the objections of the tasked conservatives, as it was assumed they would never pass anyway. Truman also wanted other Democratic initiatives, but in reality, the Republicans were so upset at this blatant political move that they passed almost nothing during the special session, and Truman used this to flog them as the do-nothing 80th Congress, a cry which became a staple on the campaign trail. Later, during one of Truman's whistle-stop speeches, a voice in the crowd yelled, "Give 'em hell, Harry," and this phrase also became another staple of Democratic strategy. Truman's vigorous campaigning energized the Democratic base. On the other hand, his Republican opponent, Tom Dewey, played it very close to the vest and did not campaign in the same manner. Even though Dewey was an internationalist and privately supported much of Truman's policies, he did not speak out in support for fear of alienating the Taft isolationist wing of the party. And then even though he was a strong supporter of civil rights in his role as governor of New York, he downplayed that also to avoid offending many white voters who were still ambivalent about the issue. In reality, Dewey felt it was his election to lose and Truman's to win, and he did everything with this in mind. He also felt that if he could hang on to his Northeast base and win California, given that Earl Warren was his vice president, and the Democrats would self-destruct as Northern liberals abandoned them for Wallace and the South went for the Dixiecrats, he would be home free. However, Dewey was not the warmest of individuals. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. quipped, "Truman makes friends without influencing people, while Dewey influences people without making friends." Columnist Dorothy Thompson wrote that, "I believe Dewey had fewer real friends than any other leading candidate, and if he had been defeated, more people would have been pleased with themselves." The oft-quoted comment about Dewey was that he looked like the man on the wedding cake. Even though Dewey did not campaign as much personally as Truman did, he did send out surrogates to beat the Bushes, especially Stassen and Warren. Before Harold Stassen became a running joke as a perennial presidential candidate, he was considered a rising star in the mid to late 40s, but his performance in the 1948 campaign began his decline. At the convention, even after Dewey had indicated his preference for Warren as his running mate, Stassen shamelessly promoted his own candidacy, which came to naught. Sensing that anyone so crassly bold might make an effective battering ram in the coming campaign, Dewey deputized Stassen to carry the fight to Truman on the explosive issue of inflation, which was a dominant issue. He became embroiled in a largely pointless broadside on government bureaucracy by attacking the administration for purchasing 25 million tons of lard in 1947, blaming this purchase for the skyrocketing costs of lard and other fats. But this salvo made him look foolish. In September in Detroit, he rebutted Truman's Labor Day address, but succeeded only in alienating organized labor. After that, Stassen became a mere footnote in the campaign. Earl Warren, on the other hand, created another problem for Dewey. A story broke shortly after the convention that Warren's wife, Nina, had been previously married and had sired one of his daughters. Even though the husband had died of tuberculosis in 1919, the marriage was kept a secret from all, including Nina and Earl's other children. When the story finally broke, it created a semi-scandal, which the campaign tried to finesse as best as possible.
Could I just interrupt for a sec? So the scandal was that Warren's wife had been married before?
Right.
Is that...
Again, in the context of today, this sounds preposterous.
Right.
But,
No. I
but
just
for,
wanted
for
to... Right.
various reasons, he died naturally. It wasn't like she killed him or anything. And this was long before they were married. And I believe the daughter was very young. He never told the daughter. I think they got married shortly after he died, and he just sort of finessed the idea. And she was Warren's daughter, which she really wasn't. Again, the scandal was, in today's context, is preposterous, but at the time, this was considered to be a problem. This is kind of ridiculous. Dewey was very reserved and not get along well with the outspoken and gregarious Warren. His political positions on many issues were to the left of Dewey, but he was forced to toe the company line, which made him uncomfortable. At one point, Warren begged Dewey, who relied on bland platitudes rather than firm policy positions, "But Tom, we got to say something some at a time." Warren had a heavy speaking schedule and drafted most of his own speeches, but he found his words held hostage to heavy editing from Dewey's Albany high command. Warren commented that the press referred to the Dewey campaign as tailor-made, but tailored to fit people of any age, any size, any place, under any circumstances. Naturally, it didn't fit snugly for most. At one point, Warren fumed. "Maybe they knew what they were doing, but I can tell you that I never won any of my campaigns this way." Earl Warren was later appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by President Eisenhower in 1953 and served until his voluntary retirement in 1968. Eisenhower later rued this selection and was heard to say that his greatest mistake was sitting on a Supreme Court. The Warren Court passed many significant cases, including Brown versus Board of Education, and several others which increased the rights of accused persons and also banned government-sponsored prayer in public schools. He also chaired the Warren Commission, which investigated the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Warren became a key scapegoat for the far right, especially the John Birch Society, who used the phrase, "Impeach Earl Warren," as one of their taglines. In my conservative northeastern Ohio hometown, a sign which said, "Save our Republic, impeach Earl Warren," was at the city limits.
Just one comment. I think a lot of people would be surprised to know, the Warren Court, right? A lot of people would be surprised to learn that Earl Warren was a Republican.
Well, he was appointed by Eisenhower. Yeah, he was a fairly.
I mean, he was a Republican, though, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And when you say he was appointed, you mean he was nominated and then confirmed
Not
by
nominated,
the Senate?
nominated by
Right.
Eisenhower and confirmed by
Right.
the Senate. Right.
Right. And do you know offhand how, what the vote in the Senate was?
Well, in those days, people deferred to the president, and virtually all Supreme Court nominations were, if not unanimous.
Rubber stamped, essentially.
Right, they were rubber
Yeah.
stamped. It wasn't until, however many years ago with Robert Bork that it became an issue, and virtually every Supreme Court nomination since that time has been controversial, but in those days it really wasn't an issue. Mm-hmm. Much has been made of the serious polling errors which forecast a fairly easy Dewey victory. It must be said that polling was much less scientific in 1948 than it is today, but don't tell that to Hillary Clinton. All the popular polls, Crosley, Gallup, and Roper, predicted a Dewey victory by at least 5 and as many as 13 points, whereas Truman actually won with a 5-point margin. The existing scenario for polling was that a group of so-called experts would select potential poll participants based on a cross-section of racial, ethnic, and other criteria. Since not everyone picked would participate, they selected many more than were needed and then turned over their list to individual interviewers. It is now known that the interviewers had a lot of leeway for selecting who was to count in order to fit the constraints of a representative sample, and they had a selection bias in favor of Dewey. However, this polling fiasco was nothing like what happened in 1936, when the Literary Digest, a then popular national magazine, picked Alf Landon to defeat FDR, but in reality it was a Roosevelt landslide, with Landon winning only 2 states. What happened? The Digest used a strictly phone poll, and in 1936 telephones were not widely owned, especially by the middle and lower classes. Therefore, the poll was by definition restricted to more affluent voters, most of whom were Republican. Coincidentally, the Literary Digest went out of business shortly thereafter. However, other issues were at work besides sloppy polling. Northern liberals, led by Hubert Humphrey and his associates from the newly formed Americans for Democratic Action, a staunchly anti-communist though left-leaning organization, were initially very down on Truman, but after their success on the civil rights plank and Truman's eager acceptance of it, they campaigned heavily for Truman, undercutting Wallace's support in the process. Wallace was also hurt when it became known that he was a follower of a pantheistic religious sect known as the Theosophical Society, led by a mystic named Nicholas Roerich, who in the past had been accused of tax evasion. This group still exists, and when I worked for a health food distributor in the 1980s, several of our customers who were health food store owners were devotees. I recall one woman who placed a bag of sea salt on our computer monitor and said that it would invigorate us all. It was assumed that the Dixiecrats would sweep the South and either deny Truman a win or throw the election to the House of Representatives, where the South would hold a disproportionate amount of influence. In reality, Thurman and his party carried only 4 deep South states with 39 electoral votes and less than 2.5% of the popular vote. Wallace received no electoral votes, but given that his party was nationwide, his popular vote was about the same as the Dixiecrats. Okay, if you want to put that map up on there, Steve. Is the map up? The map.
Yep, sir.
Okay. This map, unfortunately, and it's kind of hard for me to believe, is wrong. It says that 270 electoral votes were needed for victory. Now, this was 1948, before Alaska and Hawaii were admitted as states, and vigorously supported his candidacy. Eisenhower's main opposition at the 1952 Republican Convention was none other than Robert A. Taft. The Dewey-Taft rivalry continued until Taft's death in 1953. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. All right. We will now have a brief musical interlude to be followed by Q&A. We invite you to make contributions at our website. A link will be posted in YouTube chat. We invite you to make, we encourage you to, or suggest a donation of $5, but of course, anything that you're willing to contribute, we greatly appreciate. In-person audience can scan QR codes posted around. There's one in the back, as well as there's a basket in the back if you want to drop some change in there. And again, any amount you're comfortable with is very much appreciated, and thank you all who sustain the society with their donation of time and money. It's time for our Q&A. So those of you in the audience, in the auditorium, please come up to the microphone and ask a question. So I'll start there. Those of you who are on YouTube land, please type your question into the chat, and I will ask it of John. Go ahead.
Thanks, John. I was actually born before Truman was elected. That's scary. I've witnessed in my life the transference of Truman from being a Ku Klux Klaner, plain, boring, to this almost folk hero, where he's strong, and you talk about his defense of his daughter's Margaret's piano playing, which maybe you would mention, and his the book that came out, Plain Speaking, which I'd like you to know. Maybe you can comment on that book, and the play, the one-man play, if you've seen it. So how do you explain the resurgence of Truman to a folk hero from really kind of a very boring kind of person?
Well, I think some of it was probably a revulsion against the Korean War and McCarthyism for sure. I mean, Truman was, in his administration, were blamed for a lot of the things that happened in McCarthy era. And the McCarthy era kind of kept going into the mid-50s, and then once McCarthy was discredited, I think Truman, it became obvious to people that, you know, Truman really wasn't such a bad guy, and that McCarthy was really the bad guy, not Truman, and that a lot of what Truman had done had, been good, especially the Marshall Plan, et cetera. And over time, I think people have come to realize that, and that is that the influence of the McCarthy era has faded. I think Truman's influence and his reputation has become a lot more significant than what it was before.
Thanks, John.
I didn't realize that Warren was the Dewey's running mate. So you said Dewey lost California by 1 point.
Less than 1%.
So how popular was Warren in California? I mean, was that the big surprise that they were taking California for granted?
Well, he was a reasonably popular governor. I mean, you can only do so much. I think when you're talking about losing the election by 0.5%, I mean, just a few thousand votes could have went the other way. But I don't think it was Warren's fault that they lost California. It was just that people were invigorated by a lot of what Truman's vigorous campaign. And Dewey was just, like I said, he was the man on the wedding cake. I mean, it wasn't like anybody really got too excited about him.
So Warren continued then as California governor until he
was
was appointed?
He continued as governor until he was nominated to the Supreme Court in 1953.
Just a question about how did you become so interested, or have you always been very interested in American history, and what was your process for researching and preparing for this talk?
Well, I'm not going to say that I want to compare myself to Harry Truman, but Harry Truman was always known as a voracious reader, and I've always kind of felt that I was that way myself. I always read a lot when I was a kid, and I remember when I was in college, a couple of times people would be shocked that I was actually reading something that wasn't part of the curriculum in one of my courses. And I always liked to read, and when I went into service, it was very boring, so I subscribed to the Book of the Month Club and some various other things, and I read a lot, and I still continue to read a lot. And in terms of Truman, really it was just a case of looking in Wikipedia, and I have a book about the election of 1948, and I got some notes out of that. So, but I knew quite a bit of it. I just wanted to flesh it out with some specific, information of specific details or whatever. But it was an idea that I pretty much had all along anyway.
There was this sort of through line that the left flank of the then Democratic Party was sympathetic to, interested in the Soviet Union, and critical of Truman's policy, or the more centrist policy towards the Soviet Union. Could you say more about that? I'm just curious.
Well, I think there's always been an element, and I mean, like I said before, and I don't want to denigrate anybody, but Bernie Newman, Elizabeth Warren, people like that, not Bernie Newman, but
Sanders.
Bernie Sanders, that they feel that there's too much emphasis given on capitalism, and that labor should get a fairer shake. There should be more redistribution of income, et cetera. That's always been a theme that's run through, all the way from William Jennings Bryan in 1896. That's a theme that's run through the party, and I think people just sort of felt that way. And I think in the 30s, the communists were the only ones that were standing up to the fascists. No one else was. They were the only ones that supported the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. And a lot of idealistic people felt that they were the wave of the future. Mm-hmm. This is prior to when a lot of the stories of what Stalin had done in the Ukraine with starving millions of people and his terror trials and various other things, a lot of that either hadn't come out yet or didn't completely believe it. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember, there was some Lincoln Steffens, I think was his name. He had gone to the Soviet Union in either the 20s or the early 30s, and he said, I have been to the future and it works. Mm-hmm, and a lot of people would, kind of idealistic people who didn't really want to look at the whole situation, sort of believed that. And I think there was some of that even after Stalin had signed the non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939. A lot of people just sort of, still had some residual loyalty there. And I think it was way overblown. I personally feel that Alger Hiss was probably a traitor at some level, but I don't think the State Department was riven with traitors the way Joe McCarthy made you feel.
Thank you.
Do you happen to know when Truman desegregated the military and what effect that might have had? And question number two, could you reiterate something about the whistle stop campaign? How many stops did he make, and how long did it go on, and what was his main message that he repeated?
Well, in terms of desegregating the military, I think Truman just felt that this was the right thing to do. People don't realize that when Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913, he basically segregated the federal bureaucracy. At that point, prior to that time, there were a lot of black people were more sympathetic to Republicans in those days. There were a lot of not high level but lower level people in the federal bureaucracy, and what Wilson had done is to completely segregate the federal bureaucracy. The military had always been segregated from the time of the Civil War to World War I and World War II, and Truman just felt that this was not a proper thing to do, and he did it. There was a lot of opposition to that, just like there was a lot of opposition to, including, when they put women in West Point and allowed women combat roles, and whether they would allow homosexuals to serve in the military. There's been a lot of opposition to that. That's all sort of, water under the dam now, but it was very controversial at the time, and Truman deserves a lot of credit. In terms of the whistle stop campaign, I don't have a lot of detail as to, but he campaigned real vigorously, and one of the things I wanted to do in the musical interlude was to put Judy Garland's "I'm Just Wild About Harry" to play that tune, but they said we couldn't do that because we had problems with YouTube. But people, he sort of invigorated the crowds, and Dewey was just a real bland guy, and he just never got really people excited, and that sort of turned the tide.
Any other questions? I was hoping for something from the YouTube land, but I guess you covered the topic so thoroughly that. So in that case, we will move on to. Thank you again, John. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
And John is not only a long-term member of the society. John served as a treasurer. I think you served on the board. Am I right?
Right, for 12
yes,
years.
For 12 years. So thank you, John. All right, let me. One moment. Yes, so time for our announcements, which folks on YouTube will see. You will see them projected here, and they will be on your screen on YouTube. Our next community chat will be on Wednesday, July 27th at 7 p.m. We'll share friendship, issues of the day, and fun in a caring Zoom chat. Join us to connect and appreciate and enjoy each other's company. You can find the link on our website at ethicalhumanistsociety.org/activities. And our Sunday morning programs are taking a break for the month of August. We'll return on September 11th with a new series of thought-provoking, heartwarming, and sometimes controversial speakers. We hope you'll join us here in person whenever you can. And we will also continue to offer the programming in this hybrid format. Our programs are engaging, but our community is what makes us special, and so I do hope more of us gather in person in the auditoriums where we can both engage with speakers but also socialize with one another. Now, in August, we will have some community days that are to be announced to work together on a service project, perhaps rewatch a previous talk, or just be together as humanists. And for more information on all of this and more, see our website at ethicalhumanistsociety.org, connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for videos of past speakers and future streaming programs. And with that, I wish you a wonderful rest of Sunday. Enjoy the summer, and we'll see you in the fall. Bye-bye.